Hello, and welcome once again to the Mind series. I'm Dr. Ryan Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of Mind Matters Clinic, and today's episode is going to be Autism in the Family. And with me today I have two special guests. I have Geoff Cooper and I have Shannon Gibson, and both of them are parents who have children who are on the spectrum, and I've invited them to join us today to talk about autism in the family and give kind of a personal perspective, a family perspective on having a child with autism in the family and how it might look in different families and different places, and try to give a real life picture to people of what autism is like and how it might affect you and your family. So before we start and go too far, I'd like to review autism a bit, because I know some of you may not have been present for some of our prior episodes. So I'm basically just review what we already know about autism. Autism is a spectrum, it's called, which involves three different diagnoses or three different diagnostic categories. One would be autism or full spectrum autism. It's something else called Asperger's syndrome, which is something which is a form of it with some differences, and then something called pervasive developmental disorder, which is something which is a milder form in a sense of autism. So all three have little differences as far as what kind of symptoms or signs you might see that individual, but all of them are really lumped together in what we call the spectrum, because even within certain categories you can have more or less severity as far as any of the things that you might see. So even a child with PDD, which is the pervasive developmental disorder, may be more impaired than a child with Asperger's, so it's not really one being more severe than another, but just different. Some of the basic traits you see with children with autism, one would be the social difficulties. Children with autism oftentimes have a significant difficulty knowing how to relate to their world. They don't understand the normal social rules. They don't understand how to engage with other people, especially in nonverbal ways, but also in verbal ways. They don't know how to engage in a conversation, how to read facial expressions to know how to respond. And even if they are, they don't always know that they should respond and what's appropriate. They don't always know that the things that they do are going to create thoughts and feelings in other people surrounding them, so they go ahead and they continue with their behaviors not knowing that it's going to affect other people. Sometimes they're seen as being very isolated or to themselves, and autism actually means to oneself, which means staying within oneself. So sometimes kids with autism look very self-centered. They look like they prefer to be alone, which is oftentimes what they end up doing because they don't know how to engage or relate with others. One of the other core features of autism is difficulty with communication. And communication can be in the way that you make sounds or words. There are some kids who can't speak. They don't have the capacity to use words or language in a normal way. But they also have difficulties oftentimes in using words or communication in normal ways. Sometimes they speak with a tone of voice which is too high or too low, or lacks any sort of cadence or rhythm or inflection, so they can't make their voice or their communication interesting. It can come out very monotone. So it makes it sometimes boring to listen to, or make them sound like a little professor. They'll talk about it. Or they'll speak with a very monotonous type of voice like this and don't have any sort of expression with it. That kind of a thing. Sometimes they're nonverbal. They don't speak at all, and they have to use other ways of communicating, either through using signs or using icons or using computer or things like that to express themselves, which can be very, very frustrating because they can't communicate. One of the last things that they have is areas of specific interest where they can fixate on certain things that they really enjoy or they get stuck on. And so they will become fascinated to an extreme with certain things, especially things like facts and details of sort of things. So if they like Thomas the Tank Engine, it's not just because they like to play with trains. They will know everything about Thomas the Tank Engine. They will know all the facts and details, yet they usually have a significant difficulty with any sort of imaginary world. They can't make Thomas the Tank Engine become something else. They don't understand the concept of that becoming an imaginary something else. They oftentimes are very, very fixated on routines or rigid in their beliefs of things. They're very black and white about understanding things. So oftentimes they can look kind of obsessive compulsive in their approach to life, and so that's that one piece. So they have this kind of rigid obsessive piece. They have this difficulty with communication, either verbally or knowing how to use language in an appropriate way. And then they have this big piece which usually impairs their ability to socialize, their ability to engage with other people. And that can start from a very, very young age. And I'm sure our guests today can validate that you see something different even early on in kids with autism that isn't quite right. So first and foremost, I think I'd like to just go ahead and ask Shannon to describe her son and what she saw, her sons actually, her son, what she started seeing, what kind of problems that he may have right now, what his diagnosis is. Why don't you share us with that?
Okay, I have two sons. One is just about to be 7 and the other is just about to be 5. When Josh, our oldest, was about 3.5, we took him in to be diagnosed. He always would play with all of his toys in a line. Everything had to be the same. Doors would have to be closed. He didn't make eye contact. He was a really late speaker. And none of it really stood out when you just took one thing at a time. We had him diagnosed, and they said he wasn't autistic at the time. Then we had our son Brent 2 years later, and he was completely different than our oldest. He didn't have the typical signs of autism. He was affectionate and loving, didn't need a structure, loved people. And so when he had trouble talking, we just blew it off as it's just a speech delay, and we'll get him speech therapy. Went through that for about a year, and then the behavior really started coming on towards that end of the year. We've now had him diagnosed through the state as autistic, and he, right now, his biggest problems where you see concerns are in behavior. He screams a lot, he never slept, and never played with any of his toys quite appropriately. His cars weren't cars, his trains weren't trains, his stuffed animals were cars. And so he was different than our oldest, but they're both on the spectrum somewhere at varying degrees.
And Geoff?
Connor was, he seemed pretty normal at first. He's our first boy. We have 4 girls before him, and so he was interested in boy things, cars and bikes, but he would, turn the tricycle over and spin the wheel and just watch it. He would take all my cards out of my wallet and he would line them up along the bathtub, so I thought, well, he's a neat kid. He's meticulous, and thank goodness he doesn't take my cards all over the house, And he would just lay on his belly and look at the cars and just spin the wheels, and pretty self-contained for a long time. He was easy to entertain. You could put him in front of a video, or he would just entertain himself with the cars. I thought, oh, what a mild, young man, easy, mild-mannered. And as time went on, he became more frustrated, and he started to have these screaming fits, and he would just scream at the top of his lungs to the point where we'd be talking on the phone to relatives, and then he would, whatever it was that set him off, he would be in the background and screaming, and there's Connor, that's how he became known. And we really just thought, other things we saw were like, he'd be out playing with his peers, and he really didn't play with them. He played around them, or he played in the vicinity. And high school, family, dynamics, classes and stuff like that. So, well, he's just not socializing yet. He's kind of hasn't reached that point yet. You see, he started making up all these things to explain their behavior, to make it in your normal parameters. And so we let it go, And then, but you would call his name. He would get on his bicycle and he would start, or his trike, and he would start pedaling down the road, and you'd call after him, Connor, and he wouldn't respond. He would just keep going. You thought, oh, he's strong-willed. And so you'd yell, Connor, and it got bad because he'd roll right out into an intersection, and then he would scream when you'd grab him and say, oh, he's just a strong-willed child. We're just going to have to brace ourselves for this. And the thing that keyed us off that got things started for us is we took him to a church event, and there was a DJ playing, and he hold his ear, you know, and he wouldn't go in the room, he'd just hold his ear, and thought, well, maybe he's got some hearing issues, and we took him to Kaiser to get a hearing assessment, and he was still this time probably 2, and it didn't turn out much, and even the hearing specialist said it's kind of hard to get a good test out of a 2-year-old. They don't communicate that well because you got, you know. So again, another event a little while later, he holds his ear, a Christmas party, I think, he holds his ear again, and so we take him back, and she says, well, he should be speaking more now, and he had this babble, but he wasn't speaking with peers, and his peers by this time, he's like almost 2.5, and we noticed that they're starting to speak in small sentences to each other and to adults, and Connor wasn't even near that. He had his own language, and you would look at his face, and he's intent on trying to communicate something, but it was not anything that any of us understood. And so we said, okay, let's do, like kind of like what you said, well, maybe he's got a speech delay. And so we started there, and it was when the second speech therapist came to our house, and he spent some time with Connor, and then he let Connor go, and he pulled us aside, and he said, what do you know about autism? And the only thing I knew about autism was the movie Rain Man. And so I was like, what? And he goes, I think your son is autistic. And my wife starts crying. And I'm like, no way. This is my son. And this is my first son. And we have race cars, we have motorcycles, and we have football in the future. This is not part of the plan. And my reaction was very defensive. And one of like, hey, you're I can't remember if he's a student or he's a new therapist, and you're looking for diagnoses. That's what you do. That's what your business is. That's what you thrive on, and you're full of it. And my wife's crying because this is her little boy, and what do you do now? And what does it mean? And we had to work through that. My wife jumped right on top of, okay, if this is what it is, then what does it mean, and what do we do? And I came along a little slower because that just wasn't in my plan and my vision for my son.
Well, you bring up a few good points, both of you. I mean, one common thing is the eye contact. And you'll notice that a lot of times that when kids, and I remember our son Mitch when he was young, and again, it's something you look back in reflection, you say, it was interesting when he was a kid because you would look at him, you'd smile, you'd laugh, and he wouldn't respond. You'd go do all that kind of fun stuff like that, and there was no response. And you think, okay, well, maybe if I really overdid it, he might smile. Or he would not look at you when you're talking, like when you say you call after him with a tricycle. Most kids, when they're strong-willed, if they're going to do that, you're going to yell after them, and if they're strong-willed, they'll kind of turn around and kind of give you that look that says, I'm going to do it anyway. Watch this. I'm going to get this. But a kid with autism, I remember Mitch, same exact story, heading towards the end of the driveway and calling after him. You think, kid must be deaf.
Yeah.
He's absolutely no response, no reaction, nothing. He's walking off into oblivion. And you're thinking, what is it with this kid? Strong-willed? He doesn't seem strong-willed otherwise. Yeah. But it just seemed like he ignores you. And so that's the eye contact thing we used to do with Mitch. We'd always take his face and go, look at me. We'd hold his poor little face like this and say, look at me. Just somehow, because if you're looking at somebody, like I'm doing now, then I'm talking to you and not you, right? So if you're doing it this way, then you're showing a sign of respect. You're showing somebody that you're listening to them. And those are social things. They're not related to actually being able to hear, because you can hear me just fine if I'm talking this way. So with a kid like that, you're always trying to bring their face to you to show respect and show that they're listening. So you see that. The other thing both of you mentioned was the screaming. We have this extraordinary response oftentimes with something that seems really trivial. You know, pulling him off his tricycle is heading off into traffic. Well, of course I did. I'm rescuing you. Yeah. And instead, in an autistic kid's mind, he thinks this is okay. I should be able to do this. Yeah. And so you yank him off the tricycle, and he screams, and you're kind of going, "What is it with you?"
Well, kind of like you were saying, the patterns that Connor had. Connor was very slow. He does a lot better now, but he had to have a lot of structure. And so when he was doing something, and you wanted to talk to him, or you wanted to, it was time to go to bed, or it was time to eat, or maybe time to go to the bathroom, and you would interrupt that. Until we understood where he was coming from, it was it's a fight again. It was a fight on everything, and you get exasperated as a parent. And we even had family members make comments off to the side. If this was my kid, I'd do this and this, or when are they going to handle him? Get a little bit sterner with the boys, and it was easier to take that stuff as we could understand things from his world. And one of the best things that helped us was, one of the things we heard you say when we went to one of your open houses at the clinic was, if your child's blind, you don't get mad at him because they can't see, and if he's deaf, you don't get mad at him because he can't hear your voice. So if your child's autistic, you don't get mad at him because he's not atypical. You just or neurotypical. You just say you have to start to look at things from their side of the mirror per se.
Yep, looking at a kid through the autistic glasses, right? Another thing you talk about, that rigidity or transitioning from things. If they're stuck on something, and that's always creates conflict in the family. Say he's interested in playing with his toys, even if they're not played with right. Or you go to interrupt, he has his cars all lined up like that, and you look at it and you just say it's a bunch of cars lined up, so what? Let's play with them. And you go reach out to grab one of those things and you pull it out of the line, what happens?
45-minute meltdowns.
Yeah.
And why?
Because you interrupted what was supposed to be.
Which makes absolutely no logical sense. And so as a parent, again, you're left really feeling very confused because you go, what do I do for this? What do I do for this child when he does that? Because it's not a big deal. Look, Brent, I just moved your car. No big deal. Get over it. I mean, it shouldn't be a big deal, but it is. And then until you understand that, you keep making that same mistake. You keep disrupting their little lives, not knowing that's what you're doing, and it just keeps setting them off. And so typically fathers...
Well, I was going to say, I'm looking at how I raised my kids, my 4 girls, and there's a way a family runs, and so you start to lay down the family path and what your role is in it. And then you get a child like Connor was, and you couldn't get him in that path, and you couldn't. And the day I learned that I had to deal with him different was, I told just before, but we were at church, and he was hard to go to church with because besides his rigidity
Hard
and
for
what
church
he
to
needed,
have him at church.
yeah. So one day he was acting up as normally he did. His screaming fit was coming out, so I take him out of the main meeting and I take him outside and I swat him on the butt and try to get his attention, and I get on my knees and I look right in his eye and I realized as I looked eye to eye that he had no idea why I did that, and all he knew was, I love you. And why did you just do that? And it made no connection. I realized at that point that I have to deal with this kid on a whole different level. And it made me a better parent for it. I had realized that I had to start gaining skills on how to work within his world and not expect him to work within mine, because he definitely couldn't see my world at all.
And typically in families, you'll find parents arriving at that place at a different time and in different ways. And I know for Kim and I, it was a real struggle because nothing was ever happening at the same time for our realization as far as Mitch goes, because one parent might start to realize that this behavior is of Mitch, and this one might not see it initially because just like being a father, you want to say he's not listening. Well, if he's not listening and he's not listening to mom, he sure as hell is going to listen to dad.
Yeah.
So dad's going to put down the law. And dad's going to make sure that strong little bugger is going to listen to him. Well, that worked really well. Instead of a 45-minute screening match, it was an hour. So I fixed his wagon.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you see a lot of parents oftentimes start to blame each other for the behaviors that they're seeing. You're too indulgent. You're too strict. He's just not social. He hasn't had enough opportunities to be social. I hear that a lot. You think how many kids actually have to have a structured social thing to be social. I mean, social for a kid and his parent, that's lots of social things. How many times do you try to interest your kid in this? There's something called joint attention, when you look at your child and you want to say, hey, look at the clock up there. And then his eyes follow yours up there, and you do that with an autistic child.
Yeah.
You can do it 6 times, and you go, no, don't you see? Over here, look. So you finally get him to look there because that's how you're trying to do it, but it doesn't work. And so he's saying, well, what's with that? Why does he do that? For my own personal thing, with Mitch, we went through a long period of time of struggling with that. He wasn't learning, he had a speech delay. By the way, speech delay is probably one of the most common reasons a child starts being evaluated for autism. It's less often the social issues, it's less often the fixations and things like that initially, because those can be blamed on being just a bad boy or a bad girl. But the speech thing is the most common thing, but even Mitch had a speech delay and nobody really zeroed in on that. So we didn't have much help with that. We took him different places. We had him see a psychiatrist. We saw another psychiatrist. We went to UC Davis. We went different places, all with these descriptions, which in hindsight were pretty classic autistic traits. And we were given a variety of diagnoses, which I guess if you put them all together, like you said, it's, you know, they can see this one little piece over here where he fixates, and then you see a speech delay, and you see you have trouble with socialization, but you see those as all isolated things. You don't know that it's all really part of the same thing. So instead of that, we had them see different people who identify these different things, and nobody ever put it together. So for us, it was a real difficulty finding help. Even getting to a diagnosis was difficult. How about you?
I think one of the things that's maybe different or even better for parents at this point in time was you guys are on the leading edge of this age group, the swell of, and the growth of kids, the number of kids that are being diagnosed with autism. And so a lot of people just weren't familiar in lining those things up. And I find, you know, my son's 7, that a lot of that groundbreaking, work's been done by yourself and other families. So clinicians are seeing, connecting the pieces quicker. But as a parent, you look at those things and you just see them as your child. And you have to get over that barrier that, you know, he's not just meticulous, he's just not mechanically inclined. It's not, that may be the case, but to get past that barrier of what you'd like your child to be versus where he really or she really is, to move on to deal with what actually is the biggest step. Because you either see them as a bad kid, or you see them as a strong-willed child, or you see them just as a nice, quiet, meticulous, or mechanically inclined, but you kind of make it all up. And so for a parent to get educated and know people and see that all those together actually may mean something else, and that there's something that you can do with that.
How old was Connor when he was first diagnosed?
He wasn't 2.5 yet, because we had to wait till he was about 2 years old, because we had to wait till he was 2.5 to get him in the structured preschool program here in Calaveras County.
Okay.
So at 2.
Now for you, yours was, you know, Connor was diagnosed relatively early, yet in your situation, it was much later. How did the first evaluation go, and how was it explained to you, those behaviors?
When we went down to UC Davis Mind Institute with our oldest, they went through and we probably had 5 hours of evaluation with different tests over, you know, different, like 3-week period. And then they sat my husband and I down and told us he wasn't autistic, but he was developmentally delayed. And like both of your stories, I cried. My husband said, no way. And so we just kind of went with that with him, and we got him into a preschool that really helped him. It wasn't until our youngest was diagnosed, but he wasn't diagnosed until he was 3.5. We had the first referral when he was 2, but both Darren and I said, no, he's not autistic. We know all the signs. We know what to look out for. We have been looking out for them. He doesn't have any of those. So we didn't get him diagnosed until he was about 3.5. And since both have been diagnosed, especially living in a small community, it's hard to find resources that you need. I've been fortunate that we've had 2 close friends with autistic children and their family about 2 years ahead of us. So we've kind of followed their paths, gone to Mind Matters, and got a lot of information online and about nutrition. But when you live in a smaller community, a lot of times it's hard to find anybody that has gone through what you've gone through. And until you do, it's really hard to describe to somebody what it's like living with autism.
Now, there's a lot of times in small town, people end up, because they don't know about other people, they end up feeling pretty isolated. Mm-hmm. Because then you get that diagnosis, and yes, you cry, all that sort of happens, and then you really don't know where to go. Because where do you go? I mean, you go to your ordinary doctor appointment, and they will look at you and say, oh gosh, yeah, well, go somewhere. you know, and then there is no somewhere, and for us, I know there was no somewhere. You know, the places we got referred to were, might as well have been a different planet, you know, go to San Francisco or go to Sacramento for any kind of routine care was virtually impossible. And you add to that, you add to the family that's overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and then you tell them to make these long drives somewhere to someone who really may just have one part of them in mind. So if you go to see a psychiatrist in Sacramento and then you go somewhere else to see a psychologist and you go somewhere else to do a behavior or do social thinking or something like that, then your child gets fragmented in all these places, which is what we kind of attempted to do, and terribly frustrating because it is recognizing that the families are overwhelmed once they get that kind of a diagnosis. And what you really want, and know what we really wanted, was somebody to just take us in and say, okay, this is what you need, and this is how you can get there. And you know, we never got that. And that was, you know, obviously that's what My Matter is all about, trying to change that course for other people who have that kind of a struggle.
I think it's important for families that may see this and relate to it. We found ourselves, before you get the diagnosis, you're already frustrated because you have this one child that takes up the majority of your family's time and energy. And then you find the diagnosis, and then you're emotionally stretched even further. And then, as for ourselves, I think it's getting better, primarily because of Mind Matters, and as awareness goes on. You go to your doctor, our doctors are not of much help, our regular, within our health plan doctors, and some of them even really denied that was even anything to be diagnosed at all. And then, so when the time you get to somebody that can help you out, you're frazzled. You're really at your wit's end, and emotionally, energy-wise, sometimes even money-wise, financially, and that's normal. And one of the things that we liked when we came to one of your open houses again was that you were trying to create a place where, as you brought your child in and you were sitting in the waiting room and he had a 45-minute meltdown waiting for his appointment, everybody there would understand exactly what was going on and say, let me hold your purse, or I'll watch your other two kids while you kind of take care of this. And nobody'd be like going, what's wrong with them? And they had to take care of that kid.
No, it's like having a safe zone.
A safe zone, exactly.
And it is. It's very nice to be able to get to a place like that, and it's very nice to provide that. And speaking for other doctors, you know, did my family practice training, and I didn't get any specialized training in autism. I was aware of it, but you know, had I not had a son with autism, and had I not done all the studies since then, you know, if a parent came in, and I would be compassionate. You know, I'm a pretty compassionate doctor, but by the same token, I wouldn't have a lot of tools to offer that family. I'd look at them and say, okay, your son has autism. Now what?
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't know exactly where to send you, how to get help, that sort of a thing, because even within the small community, there really isn't some place to send them, except maybe send them to the school district. And the school district's going to have pretty limited abilities to do things like that.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, then, what we understand from this part is that we understand that the kids can be very different, but though they have some similarities, and that we're going to see a lot of kids that have these unexplainable behaviors that people have struggled putting together as a piece until you find somebody who really knows how to put those pieces together, and that's really valuable. And once it's there, then you're validated as a parent to say, okay, these concerns are real, now we have some way to treat it. And so in our next segment, I'd like to talk to you both again about what do you do for a child with autism, what works, what doesn't, and what ways have you been able to find support. So stay with us for our next episode, and we'll talk more about how to get help for your child with autism. Thanks for helping.